Hey guys, how are y'all doing? I know I've been away for quite a while. I'm finding that sometimes life throws you a new season that requires you to focus more of your energy on learning how to live in it. And even if my creative work becomes a little smaller or slower for a time, that's okay. It doesn't mean I've forgotten it or that I don't care about it. Now, in spite of my busyness, I actually have been watching quite a few different shows and movies, and when I reached out to my peeps on social media, they seemed to want me to talk about XMen 97 the most, with Paramount Plus's new TMNT show and Tower of God Season 2 coming in second. I'm not sure what kind of videos to make about everything, but I thought it would be interesting to review both XMen 97 and TMNT together and then compare them. This might seem like a weird pairing, but hear me out. They're both Western animated series, and they're both based on very old comic books. And finally, they're both stories that mean a great deal to me personally. I love both of these franchises. I was actually really surprised at some other similarities I found in these two series, but we'll get to that. First up, XMen 97.
There is no love without sin. For love is best measured in what we forgive.
Now, just so you know where my perspective is coming from, I probably don't qualify as a huge Marvel nerd, but I think I do know enough to be more than a normie. I've read several large volumes collecting classic X-Men comics. I've seen nearly all the Fox movies and enjoyed most of them, and I love the animated series Wolverine and the X-Men. However, I have not seen the original X-Men animated series, which is unfortunate because it seems like this is actually a sequel to that. I didn't fully realize that going into it. This might make some of my criticisms of this show unfair. However, at the same time, I also kind of feel like this series should be able to stand on its own enough for you to follow along, without feeling obliged to watch every single episode of the old series. That said though, the series was still quite enjoyable for me. The vibe was nearly perfect. It gave me so much nostalgia for the original comics, which are my favorite. And for the most part, this series does seem to stay true to the heart of what made the X-Men so good in their original run. The animation is beautiful. The fight scenes have so much impact and are breathtaking to watch. Even though some of the character designs have been changed a bit, especially Magneto, they still look super sleek to me and have a nostalgic vibe to them. My favorite character in all of X-Men, period, has always been Nightcrawler. So it's unfortunate that he wasn't in this series very much, but it does seem like this is because he's only just starting to get involved in the story. And when he was on screen, I was thrilled to see that he's still a man who openly talks about his Catholic faith, while never coming across as heavy-handed or judgmental of anyone else. His angelic heart contrasts his demonic appearance so strikingly that you fall in love with the character instantly. Now, as for the story and the overall show, does it work well together? Yes, generally, mostly. The premise of the story is very interesting because it flips our concept of X-Men on its head a bit. It starts out by having Xavier recently assassinated and somehow deciding to leave it in his will for Magneto to care for the X-Men in his stead. They of course don't trust him, but out of respect for Xavier, they allow him to lead, or at least attempt to make up for his past acts of anti-human terrorism. Cyclops and Jean are married and expecting a child, so they consider leaving the X-Men. Of course they don't, and I actually find that a little disappointing. But then again, I also want to see them fight in this show, so I just think that storyline might have been interesting, but they throw it away really fast. I really love how this series starts out. It's later on that it gets a bit muddy for me. My biggest complaint would be that I didn't always understand what was going on. And yes, part of that might be because I haven't seen the OG series, but I think it's also a pacing issue. Some things, like the final villain Bastion, didn't feel like they were being built up to noticeably enough, so that when it did happen, or rather when he arrives on screen, it felt really sudden to me. That being said though, I actually thought Bastion as a villain was delightful. I just wish that I was able to fully understand and follow his part of the story sooner. But having this sort of human sentinel character is really genius. He gets to be a part of both worlds and has to choose one side or the other. And I think ultimately he chooses neither side, and sadly just gives in to despair in the end. I really loved the parts that explored Cyclops and Jean's relationship and their role as parents. There were some scenes with them that were genuinely moving. But I really didn't like the clone plot. I don't care if that was in the comics or the cartoon or whatever. I mean, on the one hand, I thought the issue was initially well resolved. I mean, it was better than I could have written it. But on the other hand, the thought that a clone had fake memories and was just inserted just in time to have a child with the husband of the original is just gross. The kind of drama that comes with something like that is just so messy, I'm not sure it's worth having as a plot point. And to make matters worse, instead of leaving it resolved, the issue gets dragged out further, which creates some strife in Cyclops and Jean's relationship, which I felt really distracting and unnecessary. Generally, I think taking the time to focus on character relationships is awesome, but not to the point where it starts to feel almost petty and annoying. Overall, I liked this version of Magneto. I loved him at the beginning when he was genuinely trying to honor Charles and put his own agenda aside, and he was still decent at the end, but I'm also just a tad frustrated with him. I guess I was a bit disappointed to see Magneto embrace his old persona again after he had come so far. Maybe because I'm also freaking tired of seeing him do that over and over again in the movies. However, I can also understand him when I see that the country and culture he put his heart and soul, his entire life into building, was destroyed before his very eyes, for no just reason at all. This alone could break anyone, especially after all that this particular guy has been through when he was a child. So it does make sense that he would return to what feels familiar. It just also feels pretty predictable and like it's been done before. I love that we really get to delve into his mind with Charles. This was a very realistic depiction of trauma and panic. I just felt like maybe we could have fleshed out Magneto a little bit more for this to hit even harder. But still, I'm so grateful for what we got. Speaking of Charles, though, what the hell, man? I'll get back to you in a second. You're lucky I have to finish up with Magneto first. The line spoken by a human, Magneto was right, is edgy and ironic, and I'm sure it felt like it slapped. But whether or not it's true, or that it actually makes sense in the story, you need to take that line into consideration. What did she mean when she said he was right? This line was spoken by a government liaison who came to see the error in human ways. If she meant that he was right about everything, then wow, we have some problems. Then I guess every human being just deserves to die whether they took part in that genocide or not. But if you were saying that Magneto was right, that humans are ultimately unjust, and that cycles are nearly impossible to break, then yes, I would agree with you, and that's a pretty powerful line. But should you really just throw that line out there without giving any kind of balance or clarity? When you're dealing with issues that are so serious and have such terrible real-world implications, then I think you need to be very clear and very concise with what you're trying to say. And sometimes I feel like XMen 97 doesn't know which side it's on. Now, we totally need to see things from more than one perspective, but I still feel like we need some sort of a conclusion, and maybe they're building up to it, but yeah, it's a bit muddy in the series itself right now. Now, back to this traitor. Now, in this series' defense, I just looked it up, and apparently, yes, the original series did end with Charles being nearly killed by Peter Gyrick and having to be taken to Shi'ar with Lilandra to be healed. So, continuity-wise, the series is fine with having Charles just being randomly in space. But character-wise, I'd say we have some execution problems, to say the very least. When you have Charles in space for most of the series without making any sort of contact with the X-Men until shit absolutely hits the fan, you make him look like a passive, apathetic asshole. Another character that they kind of ruined is Rogue. Also, I don't know how old she is, or how old this version of Magneto is supposed to be. He does look admittedly younger than Ian McKellen at least, but my first thought at her and him being a thing was, ew. She really seems like a cool auntie, and her fights are actually my favorite in the series. But because she keeps flip-flopping back and forth between Magneto and Gambit, instead of committing to one or the other, she ends up looking like a shallow bitch. Especially since it seems like one of the main reasons she and Magneto hooked up anyway was because he had the ability to touch her without dying. This makes Gambit look all the better to us though, because he loves Rogue whether he can touch her or not. He does not deserve to be treated the way he was in this show, for crying out loud. So I have more than a few complaints about the writing in this show. At least we do get some great character development with Storm, and the new character Sunspot was alright. I'll give more of my conclusion later, but now it's time to go to Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Hi? I don't suppose you're open to talking about this.
I'm just in charge of the snacks, man.
Similarly to X-Men, I'm a huge fan of the Turtles, and while I haven't seen or read every single issue or seen every movie or series, I have seen and read a lot. And since TMNT is smaller in scale to anything from Marvel, this makes me able to follow any TMNT story fairly well. This new series is a spin-off from the movie Mutant Mayhem, which I did review on this channel if you haven't seen that video yet. I think my biggest complaint about that movie was that the Turtles as individuals didn't get enough time to be properly developed. The series starts out with a situation that immediately separates the Turtles, and they remain separated for around 5 episodes. At first I was pissed that I wasn't seeing the turtles fight as a team, but then I realized that the story was doing this to develop each character and define who they are to the audience before having them fight together. This is so genius, and I'm really thankful that they cared enough to do this, because the action and animation is good enough so that they probably could have gotten away with not taking so much time to develop the characters. But wow, does this make the show that much better. Each turtle is likable and distinctly familiar to the earlier versions. Maybe the most different one is Donnie, since his character's defining trait of intelligence takes a more modern approach, with having him able to write computer code for AI, and also just being a nerd in more of the modern definition of just overanalyzing anime and manga. I still think this works fine and doesn't necessarily subtract from how people may have known him to be in the older versions. This Leo doesn't quite feel established as a leader yet, but he's getting there. This version of him seems to value the support of April when he feels down on himself, which I think is a good sign. Obviously, Leo has a light crush on April, and maybe that's fine. I just don't know how to feel about that if the show takes this seriously later on. It's a bit awkward to think about, but yeah, I'm just not going to think about it. I feel like a lot of versions limit Mikey to being just funny, which can feel forced in serious settings. This Mikey is funny, but it doesn't feel like he's trying too hard. I think his more defining trait than being funny is actually being easygoing, to a fault. He prefers to be passive and to flow with what everyone else is doing. He's uncomfortable with conflict and being too direct, so he struggles on his own when faced with tough decisions. The biggest deal for me is Raph because, well, you know why. And thankfully, he did not disappoint me this time. Raph is still an emotionally impulsive and aggressive dude, but what I love about this one is that he rarely comes across as genuinely mean-spirited. He's just very exasperated when dealing with a world that seems to not have the same overwhelming urges as he does. Trying to explain himself is exhausting, and trying to understand others when he doesn't feel understood is even more so. Surprisingly, this Raph is shown at least trying to talk through his feelings. He's even shown meditating and doing breathing exercises. Raphael will probably never mellow down, but he could very well be on his way to being more balanced and learning to cope with his unusually high adrenaline. There was a character named Rod, who I think is a series original, and he's a rich, lazy intern with heterochromia. This character was a riot, and I will be quoting his passive-aggressive burns till the end of time. Another highlight was this series' version of the villain Bishop. In this version, Bishop has been changed into a Spanish woman named Josefina, who is a kind, gentle roboticist, or was. The other difference here is that instead of developing a hatred for aliens, she develops a hatred for mutants. I would have had them flesh out her backstory a little further, like for example, I wish we could have seen an actual interaction between her and her late sister. However, what we get is sufficient at least, and makes for a motivated character. This Bishop only wanted to help people, as she saw her sister needed more help than most, being born without legs. But when her life's work is destroyed by the attack of Super Duperfly in the events that happened in the movie, she is devastated. This devastation turns to bitterness when she sees that the turtles benefited from this attack, while she lost everything. The world came to see the turtles as heroes and allowed them to attend school like regular humans. Perhaps understandably, Bishop is disgusted by this and harbors a deep distrust of these freaks of nature, finding technology to be more reliable since it is made by humans for humans, and she also sees it as the key to cleansing the city from this apparent plague. Is this starting to sound familiar? I was surprised at how similar the idea of the Sentinels are to Bishop's Mechazoids. And this isn't me complaining. XMen has always dealt with the issue of mutants living among humans, but for TMNT, this is the first time in history these mutants have been allowed to live freely in the open. Of course, I'm not counting the M-Day storylines in the IDW comics. So it makes sense to me that this issue comes up so quickly, as it was bound to. I'm actually surprised that more characters such as, I don't know, maybe the high school students' parents in this universe have not at least questioned the safety of their children going to school with humanoid turtles. The Mechazoids are on a much smaller scale than the Sentinels, but they're still very dangerous. They proved to be a lot more dangerous than Bishop herself anticipated. Bishop's intentions were definitely marred by a desire for revenge, but at least she always did want to help humanity in a way that would give hope to people like her sister. So when the Mechazoids start hunting down humans with slight mutations as well, remember that Rod has heterochromia? Bishop is definitely humbled. This issue is surprisingly well handled in a short amount of time in this series. The huge difference here from X-Men is that this clashing of mindsets happens in a much more personal and intimate way. It's a lot darker and more devastating in 97 to be sure. We see a whole country destroyed from pure hatred gone out of control, we see a husband and wife denied medical treatment by a doctor, and families disown their own children. But in TMNT, we see Bishop feeling wronged and allowing that pain to seep into her better judgment, causing her to ask why these creatures can suddenly be accepted after they have apparently caused so much damage. Or rather, why are they suddenly loved and accepted when she has suddenly lost everything? Bishop does at least partially come to realize what she has done wrong. Perhaps she even slightly starts to see some humanity in the turtles. This just isn't enough for her to embrace them fully, as the world seemingly has. Another significant difference is that the turtles never become angry with Bishop. They simply just try to plead to her humanity. There's no terrorist justice here. One huge complaint I have for this show, though, is that Master Splinter doesn't talk? What the frick? They come up with the excuse that he prefers to speak in vermin tongue now to be closer to his new cockroach lady wife. But are you kidding me? If this is only because you couldn't get Jackie Chan to come back for his voice, then get James Tsai to do it, since Jackie Chan actually hired him to voice himself in his own animated series. This would have made me so mad if not for the framework of some of the episodes having Raphael's perspective allow for Splinter to have a Batman-sounding voice for the sake of dramatic effect. So Splinter is able to talk in any episodes that are told through this lens, thank God. They should just keep this voice for him. I don't care if it's very different than Chan's voice. Just let Splinter talk. He's too important of a character to not have a voice. I also feel like that since it's a known fact that the turtles are attending high school, we should actually see them attending high school at some point in this series. I'm not saying we change the vibe of the show to feel like a high school drama, but I do want to see what this side of their lives looks like, so I hope they show that more in the next season. I really enjoyed both of these series, and I actually want to watch each one of them through again to better understand and appreciate them. They're both beautifully animated and well made overall. Some of the choices in writing for X-Men 97 in particular feel unnecessary and questionable to me, but it does feel like we're also just getting started, and we have some seriously epic moments that harken back to the comics so hard that I wanted to get up and cheer a few times. I can see the majority of adults leaning toward 97 as the better of these two, but for me personally, or at least so far, I do prefer the smaller scale, more personal stories being told in the simple framework of Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But mostly, I'm just amazed and grateful that we have two really solid animated series to come out in 2024. Basic quality and competency seems to be sorely lacking, so please make more shows like this, I'm begging you.